Well, of course, we are they, and there's a bit of a paradox because we tend to project, human beings in general tend to project our shadow onto others. And this is one of the most obvious things about shadow projection. And Jung wrote a lot about that. And, the Nazis wanted to have a thousand-year Reich, but they accused the Jews of trying to control the world. So basically, people will often project onto some other group exactly the qualities of their own group or qualities that they fear about themselves and this type of thing. On the other hand, to be fair, the other side of the paradox is that there really are some creepy theys out there.
Hmm.
And sometimes the dark force, in a way that seems to have possibly even occult depths and mysterious depths, something that we talked about the other time, mind parasites, where certain groups seem to be the carriers of the dark force at a particular time. The most obvious example would be the Nazis, and and then it sort of leaves the Germans, and now they seem like these wonderful, lovely people. And so Jung talked about how groups and nation states can have a collective psychosis. So on the one hand, we have to be careful about people we're calling they, and we see that certain groups, and it's often very political. Now, of course, America, as you know, tends to have this big divide between the red and the blue, between the extreme conservatives and more liberal folks. And some say you could see it as basically a continuation of the Civil War. And so each side has a certain they. But what unites, say, the left wing of the United States and even many people in Europe and intellectuals in the West is that there is a certain political correctness as to which they can carry the dark side of the force. And so, for example, any type of darkness can be attributed to America, Israel, or globalizing corporations. But it is not politically correct to find darkness in, say, a non white group or a culturally exotic group. So you can see certain, and many of my friends, for example, who have no problem attributing all kinds of nefarious motives to the US, Israel, and corporations. And of course, all three have a huge hook for those shadow projections. They all have plenty of darkness in them, but they can't find darkness in, say, Islamists, for example, because because this is a culturally exotic group, so anything evil about them must be merely reactive. It must be something that was done by the US or by Israel or by corporations. But conveniently, they'll forget that before there was an Israel or a US, Islam had a world conquering jihadist aspect that caused them to almost conquer Europe. They were stopped on September 11th outside the gates of Vienna, like 1638. So we have this tendency to, and of course, then people who are on the conservative side, they can see plenty dark force in Islam, but they can't see anything in the United States. The U.S. is perfect, except that we have an unfortunate African American president, according to them, and so forth. And so people tend to split in this way, where they can only attribute the dark force to some group that they see as other than themselves. Though sometimes, like with people on the left, they are more likely to see the dark force in groups that they consider other, but that are culturally coming from a more similar demographic as they are, and they just feel it's improper to see darkness in indigenous peoples or in any people that is not from the Western world or that kind of model. Well, I think it is the primary psychological fear. I think nobody said it better than Stephen Crane, who's an American poet and probably wrote this around 1900 in a very short poem, one of the few I've ever memorized, called The Wayfarer. The wayfarer, perceiving the pathway to truth, was struck with astonishment. It was thickly grown with weeds. Later he notices that each weed is a singular knife. Well, he mumbles at last, doubtless there are other paths. So this is really the position of most people who get into some kind of psychological work or into some kind of occultism or New Age or many of these sorts of things is that when it comes to the place where they stop is when it comes to facing their own darkness. And it's like Goethe said, if you want to clean up the whole world, begin with your own doorstep. Or one time when Jung was teaching a psychological seminar in the Weimar Republic, and there were Nazis literally goose-stepping outside on the street, and people said, given the condition of the world, what can we do?
Hmm.
And he said that, the act of moral courage to reclaim your own shadow from the world, if everybody did that, most violence would vanish because most collective or individual violence is done in a state of projection, of shadow projection. And so, but it's something that people famously don't want to do because it's unpleasant. It could feel at times like you're doing an autopsy on yourself. You have to face all the things. I mean, by definition, the shadow is what we don't want to face about ourselves. So there's an enormous reluctance. If I can get somebody else to carry my shadow for me, then I think I'm the good guy. And if there's one thing we know about how humans see the world, there's a famous story structure guru named Robert McKee, who is sort of like the screenplay guru for Hollywood. And I went to his story structure seminar once, and he talked about the key to understanding almost any character is to realize they always see themselves as the good guy. And he was working out at a gym at the time in Lower Manhattan, and where a lot of guys in the mafia were. And one of them asked him at one point, "Are you one of the good fellas?" And of course, we know the Martin Scorsese film Goodfellas.
Hmm.
So everybody sees themselves as the good guy, and there are even all kinds of research studies and statistics that show that people think that they're kinder than average and smarter than average and so forth. And they would rather see other people wearing the black hat. This is just the way that the ego likes to organize the world. And so we would rather project that out onto others. And where we also see huge failures with this is with people following Eastern paths, which are often glorified in the West and
Hmm.
amongst New Age people, and there's a lot to be said for them. But if you look at all the Eastern gurus from the Hindu and Buddhist traditions who've come West, and how many of them turned out to be sex predators, even though many of them may be spiritual geniuses, like a Choyam Trungpa, who's founded Naropa right here in Boulder and wrote amazing books like Shambhala, The Sacred Path of the Warrior, and Spiritual Materialism, and so forth. But he turned into a total womanizer, did things that would get him arrested nowadays, and drank himself to death in his early 40s. And what seems to be going on with a lot of these Eastern gurus is they may actually reach states of samadhi or these incredible states of enlightenment. They focus on the vertical axis of spiritual transcendence. But what tends to happen is you don't stay at that state. You come back to baseline where you have this whole horizontal plane of psychological integration that's been totally neglected, and you think you're totally enlightened, so you don't recognize that you have a shadow, and you rationalize it in a sophisticated charismatic way, like Choim Trungpa would talk about the crazy wisdom path to explain all his criminal antics, basically, and self-destructive and destructive antics. And his chosen successor, by the way, who was from the West, slept with many male disciples, spreading AIDS, causing at least one of them to die. And so you have what happens is you have people who think they're enlightened. They haven't done the shadow work, and therefore their shadow acts as an autonomous complex, completely running the show.
Hmm.
And so this is a very common thing that happens to people.